While modern psychiatry has improved many patients' quality of life, sometimes it might fall short in addressing their relational and spiritual needs. Can we draw on ancient theological wisdom as well as scientific evidence to reframe our understanding of mental health care? That's what we're talking today on the Attaching to God podcast. I'm Jeff Holsclaw. Sid is not joining us today, but this is an interview podcast, and here we are seeking to explore a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation. Today, I'm excited to have Dr. Warren Kinghorn. He is a psychiatrist and a theological ethicist who works at the center of the role of religious communities in caring for persons with mental health care problems. He is jointly appointed to the faculty of Duke Divinity School, as well as the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences of Duke University Medical Center, and he is a practicing psychiatrist at the Durham VA Medical Center. Dr. Kinghorn, thank you so much for being on today.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And please call me Warren. Thank you so much.
Warren,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Well, I was really excited to kind of come across your book, and we're going to jump into that in a second, which is called Wayfaring. But how did you, let's start with the field of psychiatry. How did you become, I was raised at evangelical, so I'd say something like, how were you called into the field of psychiatry? Can you give us the origin story a little bit there?
Yeah, actually, it has very much to do with my being a Christian. I was also raised in a evangelical Southern Baptist context, and I didn't have any direct serious mental illness in my family, as many clinicians do and have really powerful family stories. But I was part of a church where people really struggled, and I had really up close experience of people who were depressed or who were struggling with substance use or who were closely affected by suicide. And that made me, I think, just attend to the way that people live and what people engage and what they go through. I kind of was also raised in a tradition of evangelicalism that saw psychology as a good thing. And so I grew to think, oh, psychologists are doing good and important work. And so I went to college and I eventually went to medical school thinking I'd become a psychiatrist. And then I was turned off to the field of psychiatry as I was exposed to it in my first and second year of medical school. It was,
Oh, wow.
it was taught in a way that was well-intentioned, but was pretty rote. Like we had to memorize diagnostic criteria from the diagnostic DSM, our diagnostic manual. We had to do very structured interviews. It felt very kind of impersonal and not what I was used to in my other experiences of medicine. So I thought, well, I guess I'm not going to be a psychiatrist. I guess I'll be a primary care physician or palliative care doctor or something else. But I wanted to understand medicine more as a Christian. And so I left medical school for a couple of years after my third year of med school. I came to seminary here at Duke and I did a 2-year theology degree to try to understand, like, what am I doing in the world of medicine and how do I make sense of this? And it was actually that time when I got more interested in psychiatry, in part because I got interested in medicine in a different way. It wasn't just that I saw myself as a medical student and physician who had this personal faith who could inform things, but I grew to see that as a Christian, I was part of this long, deep tradition of thought and practice that is our faith. It's 2,000 plus years old. And in comparison, modern psychology and medicine are maybe 200 years old, and they're much newer and more modern ways of thinking. And that my faith not only could provide personal resources and spiritual resources, but intellectual and institutional resources for thinking about what we're doing. And that made me appreciate even more the experience of mental illness and the challenges that people go through. And I thought, like, how as a Christian can I engage healthfully in this world? And so I went back to medical school, did more work in psychiatry, actually realized that I could love it if I could get beyond the impersonal diagnosis-focused approach to it, and never looked back. It's been a really rewarding thing.
That is not the journey that most people take on these kind of issues and questions. So you went from, if I got this right, a conservative Baptist background that still had a positive view of psychology,
Yeah.
which was not my case. I was raised independent Bible Baptist who had a negative view of psychology. All those atheists, they're explaining faith away. It's really like idolatry. And then you went to medical school, and instead of like the scientific model, like feeling fulfilling, it actually was dissatisfying to you. And so to fill the dissatisfaction in the medical psychiatric kind of model, you went back to faith, which is usually the opposite of people who get like satisfied with faith when they're in school, and then they have to go to some other discipline to fix their life. So you're like tacking like, the opposite currents here, like the whole way. That's really interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of twists and turns there, but that's basically right. Yeah.
Oh, that's super interesting. Okay. Well, so you mentioned just briefly that you were kind of dissatisfied in your actual training. Could you give, because you do this in early on in your book, Wayfaring, you kind of talk about, well, there has been these kind of transformations in modern psychiatry, the mental health field. So can you, and I don't know if you could do it briefly, but just kind of talk about kind of this machine model or the machine metaphor that a lot of mental health care kind of operates in, and maybe a little bit how we got there?
Yeah. Well, first of all, how we got there, I mean, you're right. Over the last 50 to 75 years, there have been huge transformations in what we would not consider mental health care. So we kind of think of the world that we have as the world that we've always had, but that's not the case. Before World War II, there wasn't a lot of outpatient like psychiatry or psychology there. There were large psychiatric institutions. After World War II, you began to see the explosion of what's often called kind of a therapeutic culture. People got more interested in personal counseling. And often the therapy of the mid 20th century, it often engaged kind of existential questions, questions about like, what does it mean to live well? What do humans need? What does it mean to kind of live wholly and fully? You had the humanistic psychologists and existential therapists. Uh, and that I think is kind of a tide that's passed for the most part. For the
Mhm.
last 40 or 45 years, since the modern DSM, which is Psychiatrist Diagnostic Manual, has come into focus, there's been much more of a focus around like specific categories of mental illness or mental disorder. Words like PTSD, major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and people tend to seek care for particular disorders or particular problems. And psychotherapies and also other kinds of treatments are kind of focused on treating particular disorders. And
Mhm.
so modern psychiatry, psychology, other counseling and therapy disciplines have become like less focused on kind of broader questions of what does it mean to live a well-lived human life, and more like how can we bring specific things to bear on specific disorders. And and there's a lot other currents in modern mental health care too. Things have become much more industrialized, much more focused on business models, much more focused on efficiency, on payment. There's a lot of things we could talk about, but all of that kind of coalesces in what in the book I call the machine model of mental health care. And I think this is more true in my own field of psychiatry than it is in other therapy disciplines. And so I'm not trying to generalize
Mhm.
broadly, but in
Well, and
psychiatry,
just to pause
yeah,
there really quick, is sometimes people, this is kind of a comment for the general listener. Sometimes like the fields of psychiatry and then being a psychologist and a therapist and a counselor are thought to be all the same thing.
yeah.
But they're not, like they are kind of on different related. They're all dealing with kind of the inner life of the person and reducing symptoms, but they're not all the same. And so there is kind of a
Right.
specific trajectory of this maybe a slightly older field of psychiatry, of which you do have to be a medical doctor, and then the somewhat younger, not necessarily, but a tangent of psychologists, and certainly research psychologists, and then counselors and therapists, of which is somewhat of a newer field, coming up a little bit with this World War II kind of explosion of mental health professionals, as well as, and you bring this up in the book, as well as the closing of mental health institutions. So we have this climbing of mental health professionals while this falling of inpatient institutions. And this is all kind of part of the mix. So, anyways, just wanted to jump in there that,
Yeah.
yes, so you're not speaking for the whole world of all therapists, therapy, but you're speaking of your particular profession. But I think there is some crossover to some of these other ones.
Yeah. I can speak mostly about my experience as a psychiatrist, and then others who are trained in other disciplines. I invite them to kind of think about, do you see this reflected in your own training and practice? And
Yeah.
I think that's going to show up in different ways in psychology and licensed marriage and family therapy and social work and counseling and other disciplines too.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So back to the machine model. So
Yeah.
so there's this drift toward kind of treating us as machines to be fixed. Like, what does that mean? And
Yeah.
how did that kind of show itself up?
Well, the way that it works in my training and my own, even the way that I practice psychiatry now, is there's this kind of way in which we're encouraged to address patients and their issues. So people come to me with what we might consider broadly unwanted experience or behavior. They're feeling ways they don't want to feel, they're acting ways they don't want to act. And I'm trained as a psychiatrist to say, oh, I recognize what those are.
Hmm.
And so that's immediately a way of like narrating something, of labeling something. So somebody might feel generally bad, and I say, oh, that's a symptom. It's a symptom of anxiety. And then we categorize or we cluster those symptoms into categories of diagnosis or disorder. And so I say, well, based on this collection of symptoms, I'm going to diagnose you with major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or whatever the diagnosis is. And then once I have the diagnosis, then I can reach into my toolbox of evidence-based treatments and I can say, well, this is the treatment that I can match to this
Hmm.
disorder. So as a psychiatrist, I might say, here's a medication that is effective for this disorder. Or I'm going to refer you for a kind of individual psychotherapy that's specifically effective for this disorder. Or I'm going to refer you for transcranial magnetic stimulation or something else that's effective for the
Ooh.
disorder. And so what we do is we can match like treatments to disorder categories. And then if those treatments work to reduce the symptoms of the disorder, and especially if that can be shown in clinical trials to be the case consistently, we say, oh, great, these are evidence-based treatments. And so we go about our work, like naming symptoms into disorders, treating the symptoms of disorders where the goal of treatment is ultimately symptom reduction. And of
Mhm.
course, if you can develop a treatment that works, then you can buy it and can sell it, whether that's a unit of time or whether that's a medication or a device. And that fuels our like, mental health care economy in some ways, so as a
Mhm.
psychiatrist, I benefit from that. I think there's advantages to that way of thinking. I mean, I certainly believe in the scientific method as it comes to understanding what we're doing therapeutically. I think that way of thinking has led to a lot of really interesting treatments being developed and tested. And so there's many gifts to that. But I think there's some problems to it as well, that machine model of thinking about mental health care. And I call it the machine model because people can end up feeling like they're being treated as these collections of symptoms that need to be just either medicated or taken away. People feel like
Mhm.
it's this industrial process that people are going through. I think one problem is that it encourages to see mental health problems, things that are inside a person. So like people often think, well, I'm struggling because something's wrong with my own brain circuits or my neural circuits, or something's wrong with me deep inside my own personality. And it takes away the understanding of mental health struggles as challenges that we're facing in the world around
Mhm.
us and that are often challenges in relationship and in community. And that gets to, I think, your work, Jeff. It also tends to focus us on the body and the brain when the body and the brain may be the site of where the problem is, but it might not be. It might be that the
Mm.
problem is more in the communities in which we live or in the relationships in which we find ourselves. And our body and brain is just responding and reacting to those settings that are outside of us. Um, I think it sends the message also that successful treatment is a matter of reducing symptoms rather than like living well in the world. I think we know intuitively that someone can like not be anxious or not be depressed. That doesn't mean that they're living a whole fulfilling human life. But
Mhm.
if we focus
Right.
only on symptom reduction, that's typically where we get. And I think it also doesn't, this machine model doesn't really get to the kind of core questions of who we are as human beings and the core questions that we are asking ourselves, like, who am I? And what does it mean to live in this world? And do I matter? And do I belong? And am I loved? And these are questions that that I think this kind of symptom focused approach to treatment just can't really fully answer.
Yeah. Well, while you've been talking, like what keeps jumping into my mind is the spiritual formation category of sin
Yeah.
management. And it just seems like there's actually some large congruence to certain kinds of spiritual formation, which is really just like you just need to sin less and we manage our sin. And then what you're saying of like, well, we just need to reduce symptoms and that'll fix everything. I don't know if there is a lot of congruence, but that's kind of what kept jumping into my mind
Yeah.
is
I
the
mean,
Tao
reducing
school kind
symptoms
of
is a
statement.
good thing. Like if
Right,
I'm
and
really,
managing sin is a good thing too, right?
yeah,
Yes,
yeah, but it
but
doesn't
it's
get to
not
the
the
core of the
goal,
problem.
the core of the
Yeah.
problem. Right, so, well, let's kinda, shift then because, like many pastors and theologians, like myself, are kind of tacking toward, like, psychology and therapy as a way of understanding themselves or maybe their ministries. I've been moving a lot toward attachment theory. But you, as a psychiatrist, it seems like you sat down one day and you're like, you know what? What I really need more of is the medieval theology of Thomas Aquinas. So how is it? And maybe it's just a Duke thing, right? I understand that Aquinas is in the
Not the
water
most
there, but how?
popular choice. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, where did that? How did you get to Aquinas? And then also, like, not just how, but the why do you feel like bringing on this medieval theologian has been helpful for you? And I love the way you brought him throughout your whole book.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question that I ask myself sometimes. Like, why, if you want to think as a Christian about modern mental health care, would you turn to this 13th century theologian and philosopher who lived, before the advent of modern science? And I think for me, that's part of the why, for me, Aquinas, who I deal with throughout the book, is actually a great resource because he's an example of a Christian thinker who lived at a time where we didn't have our modern categories of like science versus religion or mind versus body or, mechanism versus the spirit. He lived in a world
Mhm.
where all of that was much more integrated and unified than it is now. I think part of what draws me to Aquinas is that he has this amazing personal story. Like he was, now he's kind of known as the staid, theologian. He's known for his kind of density of his writing. But in his time, he was a talented son, but not the firstborn son of a pretty wealthy family in Italy.
Mm.
And his family, as was the case, he wasn't going to inherit the estate, but his family actually wanted him to go to this like very kind of wealthy Benedictine monastery and to have a kind of life of, of status there, which is something that would bit of a done in the 1200s. And instead, he rebelled, and he got influenced by this like roving band of itinerant monks who were, going around from city to city collecting alms, and they were preaching, and they made vows to poverty, but they weren't living in a settled monastery. This was the orders founded by Saint Dominic and became the Dominican, or was the
Mhm.
Dominican order. But at the time, they were kind of rogues and renegades, and Aquinas joined them, much to the consternation of his family. Um, he also was living and working at a time where the thought of Aristotle, which had been kind of known, but a lot of texts of Aristotle have been lost in the Latin-speaking West and were mostly maintained in the Greek-speaking world of the East and the Islamic world, and they began to make their way back into Europe. And he began to read more of Aristotle, and he began to study Aristotle. And the reason why that mattered for Aquinas was that Aristotle, compared to Plato and the Neoplatonists, was very focused on like close attention to the world around us, like immediate observation of the world that's right at our fingertips and being aware of what's in front of our senses. So Aquinas both drew this like amazing depth of theology, but he also was increasingly focused on what does it mean to closely attend to ourselves as human beings and to our
Mm.
bodies and to the natural world around us. And so in that ways, he had the kind of sensibility that modern scientists and psychologists now have. What does it mean to closely observe phenomena and to reflect on them? But he had this beautiful way of doing it as a Christian. And and for Aquinas, he also lived at a time where pilgrimages were pretty common. Like medieval pilgrimage sites where people would do this. He himself walked back and forth from Italy to France a number of times,
Oh,
and so
wow.
he grew to understand that the central image of what it meant to be human is to be God's good creature, that it was to be someone who's on a journey, to be a wayfarer. And he had it's this beautiful image of humans that are God's good creatures, that are from God, on our way to God, and the end and goal of our lives is union with God, that we can only know finally in the life to come, but we can kind of know it in an anticipatory way in this life. And so we saw all of human life as this journey to God and the sacraments and the graces being given to us to kind of aid us on the journey. So when I think about the world of modern mental health, now so many people feel alone. They feel like they don't know if they matter. They don't know if they belong. And I think that image of what if we're not machines? What if we're not just like isolated people that are kind of making our way in the world? But what if we centrally are those who are on a journey to God? And that's the goal and image of our lives, that we're those who are on a journey. And to me, that's been a metaphor. That's been a way of making sense of what I do as a psychiatrist, who I am as a Christian, who I am as a friend and parent, where the key question is not like what's the problem that needs to be fixed, but like what's needed right now for the journey that this person
Mm-hmm.
that's on what's needed right now for my own journey, and how can we think about things in that context?
Yeah. Well, again, I feel like there is so much like congruence between the journey that you're talking about with like clients and patients, as well as how sometimes we talk about spiritual formation. Because sometimes the spirit, like we talk about sin management, but it's often just like, here are the right things to do and here are the right things to believe. And now you're a good Christian, rather than the kind of journey kind of aspect of, well, we're all like in process as we journey together toward, life in God, however you kind of think about that. Uh, and so you're kind of making, using Aquinas, but also just kind of, the other things that you're thinking is like, how do we shift from a machine kind of view to this wayfaring view where we're in process, we're on a journey. So what are practically, as like a clinician, how do those shifts kind of like show up kind of in your work then? Or like what's some, because it's not just the profession that kind of has this machine understanding. It's kind of our whole culture, right? So people come in with this even view of themselves as machines that need to be fixed. So how do you kind of do that work to help see this process as different and themselves as different as part of this journey?
Yeah. I mean, one comment about what you just said about the way that we think. We so often think as modern Western people, and maybe as Christians, that like the goal of our lives is to think in a certain way. And it does matter
Mhm.
what we think, but I mean, God's hope and desire for us is not that we think in particular ways, but that we become deeper lovers. And
Right.
machines don't love, but humans do. I mean, creatures do. And so, what does it mean for us to be drawn more deeply into love of God and love of others, love of ourselves, love of our bodies, love of our own experience, even when that experience is not always welcome, um, love of the natural world around us and of other creatures. Like that's the goal of our lives, is to become deeper lovers. And so not to just draw things under control or even to think in certain ways, but to be drawn more deeply into love of God. And of course, how we think
Mhm.
matters for that. How we act matters for that. What we do matters for that. And that's I think, the essence of a lot of goods of spiritual formation. My own role as a clinician, as you mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist in the VA system. So I work in a
Mhm.
government-funded system, working with veterans, and it's such a privilege to do so. But I'm not working in a like specifically Christian or specifically faith-based practice where people come to me
Right.
like because I'm a Christian psychiatrist. And I actually love that. And a lot of times people come to me just because I'm the guy that they're assigned to see, because they're struggling. So with the patients that I see, what I do is I always wanting to know not just about their symptoms, but about their stories and about their history. So we take a lot of time in the first one or two sessions that I meet somebody to talk about, like, where are you from? What was it like for you in your home growing up? What do you care about? Like, what's the trajectory
Mhm.
of your life? And that's beginning to help people to think of their lives as a kind of journey. Um, I'll always ask people, again, I'm in this general government system, but I'll always ask people, like, do you consider yourself a religious or a spiritual person? Is faith important to you? And for a lot of my patients, the answer is yes. And then we talk in like open-ended ways about that. And I can just ask questions and follow where they go. But we can often get into really, really interesting and rich conversations about their experience of God, their experience of church, their experience of another faith if they're not Christian, although most of my patients are broadly Christian. Um, and and I find that patients really welcome that. They're like, "Oh, I didn't realize I could ever talk with a psychiatrist about these questions because I didn't think anybody
Mhm.
cared or it wasn't appropriate to talk about." But but I try to just welcome people to think about that. And then when we think about like treatment planning, I think a lot of times people think of psychiatrists as the medication managers. So if you get
Right.
sent to a psychiatrist, you get sent for meds. The goal of the therapy of the treatment encounter is to come out with a prescription.
Right.
And I do prescribe a lot of medication, and I think medication can be really helpful. But I mean, the goal of a encounter with a psychiatrist should not be like to get a prescription or to even like end up on the perfect medication regimen. It should be to sit with somebody who has experience listening and discerning and figuring out like what's the best path forward, and to say, given where you are right now in your life, like what's needed right now. So for a lot of my patients, I prescribe medications, but the answer might be other things, like to get access to secure housing. It might be to get out of an abusive relationship. It might be to join a therapy group. It might be to like really invest more in participating in the life of a church. It might be to reconcile with a loved one, with whom there's relational challenges. And all of those things are things that might be needed, sometimes along with medication and sometimes without medication. So I try to kind of keep an open frame for just like what's needed right now. How can I be helpful? How can I walk alongside somebody? Again, thinking about the
Yeah.
fact that I'm also on a journey.
Well, and those last couple points touch on a whole chapter that you have about how can we hold together an inside out kind of view to mental health as well as an outside in. The inside out would be kind of like, well, I have these symptoms and problems and struggles, and then medication might help me, so that then my outward behavior is or my life feels better or something like that. But you talk about an inside out view, and you touched on some of those things as maybe we have to change our environment. Our relationships could be causing our depression, not a chemical deficiency. And so, like people and place and having a purpose, having these kind of broader things that are outside of us can then kind of get into us and change what's happening. Uh, is that kind of what you were getting at? You have a whole kind of list of these two different kind of outside in versus inside out. And I know there's a big Disney movie called Inside Out, that talks about emotions.
That's right. Which
So
is
so
great, by
you're
the way.
against
Yeah.
Disney, so we're on record for that. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
But
You just tanked me there. Yeah.
yeah, could you just kind of talk a little bit about that? How about how too often we could be on an inside out kind of perspective and what an outside in view might be?
Yeah. Well, as Christians, we affirm that we're dust, that we're creatures of dust. And so we live as bodies. Our bodies get tired, they break down, they can get sick. And so how we live, how we feel, how we think, our bodies matter for that. So our bodies are relevant. And I think Christians have nothing to fear from like well-conducted research into the biological
Right.
correlates and origins of various mental health problems, and a lot of work going into that. And Christians affirm that we're not just creatures of dust, but we learn and we grow and we discover who we are in relationship. So, I mean, from the very moment of conception, we're constituted in relationship with our mothers, with our parents, with God, with others, and then, I mean, to the central good of attachment theory is making clear how, like, from the very earliest times of our life, throughout the life course, like we're always like discovering who we are. We're finding ourselves. We're growing as selves in relationship with others. So Christians, I think, naturally should have like a biosocial view of mental health problems, not just a biological view, but a biosocial view. And when I talk with residents and students in the medical school at Duke, I challenge them to think about like two different models of thinking about mental health challenges. So one, as you mentioned, would be what we call the inside out view. And this is the idea that like if I'm feeling in a way that I don't want to feel, then the problem must be somehow inside me, like in my hormones, in my brain circuits, maybe deep in my personality. And then that shows up on the outside. So like a Duke undergraduate who's, starting the semester and feeling overwhelmed can go to the student counseling service and say, well, the problem is that there's something that's happening inside me. And then the focus is either on an individual therapy that tries to help somebody address their innermost thoughts, or it's like a medication that can help address, neurotransmitters
Right.
and that kind of thing. So the idea is that the problem starts on the inside and it shows up on the outside of relationship and community and culture. But what I encourage students to do is to turn that around and say, what if the locus of the problem, what if the problem starts not on the inside of someone's brain or body or innermost personality, but what if the problem is that we live in communities that are sometimes fractured and we have relationships that are strained and we live in a culture that's incredibly challenged in different ways. And so people can feel lonely, they can feel isolated, they can feel anxious, they can feel depressed. You can feel a lot of things in response to like relationships and communities and cultures that are not. And so in that
Right.
case, it's more of an outside in model. And so it's not that things start on the inside and they show up in relationship and community and culture, but they start with problems of relationship or communities or a culture, and then they show up on the inside of people's experience and they show up in the brain. But that doesn't mean that the problem starts on the inside. So when Christians think about mental illness, we should think not only like, how do we think about how things go on in the body, but also what's happening in the world around us. And maybe that's the place to focus and to start.
And I think that there's a lot of congruence, and you don't cover this a lot in the book, although I'm sure you probably talk this way too, is uh, we can think of sin that same way too, as sin as an inside out kind of problem. It's a behavior problem, problem of the will, sometimes a problem with what you believe that then causes you to,
Yeah.
act the wrong way. But really scripture
Yeah.
doesn't, it talks that way a little bit, right? That we're responsible for our actions, but it also talks about how sin is like an environment that we're all,
Yeah.
enslaved to, that we've been captured by sin, that sin has like
Yes.
a kingdom, in Romans 5. Um, and so it's like, yeah, like, my
Yes.
struggles might not just be my fault, although, we're all contributing. It's all a two-way environment, but right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times when I'm preaching, I always balance it and say, well, we sin, we put sin out in the world, but we are also sinned against, and that sin gets
Yes.
into us. And it's like that outside in kind of movement. And we just have to
Yeah.
be aware of those two. So it's not really an either or, right? You're trying to just kind of offer these two things. So
Yeah.
what would be the last kind of, as we kind of finish and conclude, um, uh, what would be kind of like your last hope, not just for mental health professionals, but also people in the church, like this wayfaring kind of approach to life? What has it really kind of helped you or enriched you personally to kind of make some shifts
Yeah.
or movements?
One, just to echo what you said about sin, actually, I think we do need a really robust, strong theology of sin, but we need not to reduce it, as is often the case. When I talk with students at Duke about like thinking about sin, you have these different models in Scripture of what sin is. So sin is described as a power. It's described as transgression. It's described as a breaking of relationship, and it's
Hmm.
described in some ways as a wound. And so, and that
Right.
leads to different things that we need. So if sin is a power, we need liberation. If sin is a transgression, we need absolution and confession and forgiveness and reconciliation. If sin is a relational sundering, we need restoration of relationship. If sin is a wound, we need healing. And I think
Hmm.
that's a broader way to think about like how sin operates in our world and in us. So that's just a comment on sin. But I think the bigger thing I'd like for listeners and readers of the book to come away with is that the deepest truth of who we are is not our sin, nor our suffering, nor our struggling, but it's that we as human beings are loved and known by God, and that God delights in us, and that's the deepest truth of who we are. And I would just encourage listeners and readers and anyone out there who is struggling, first of all, to know that you're not alone in the world, that God knows you and loves you. And that's probably the most important thing that we could say. It's also that if you're struggling, that there's help out there for you. And so like seeking the counsel of people that you consider to be wise, whether that's a psychiatrist, whether that's a counselor, whether that's a pastor, whether that's a spiritual director, whether that's a friend, but don't keep your struggles alone. Seek help. If you have any thoughts at all about harming yourself or about suicide, even more reason to immediately seek help, including calling the National Crisis Line 988 and to reach out to others. But don't keep things alone because we need each other. And I think being aware that like whoever we are, whatever we are, when we struggle, it's not that we just need to be fixed, but it's that we need to be accompanied. We need to be loved, and we need to have people walk alongside us on a journey. And we all need that, whether we're diagnosed or not diagnosed, whether we're struggling or not, whether we're in a helping role or not. We all need that as human beings.
Yeah, so much so. We need community, the companioning, co-laborers, and
Yeah.
the co-journeyers on the pilgrimage, which is the wayfaring. It's the traveling on the way.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on today. This is again Warren Kinghorn. He just wrote "Wayfaring: A Christian Approach to Mental Health" that just came out just a couple months ago. Are there any ways that people can kind of follow you or keep track of the other kind of work that you do?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm a co-director of an initiative at Duke called the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. And at Duke Divinity School, we're an initiative in the Divinity School that specifically exists to connect Christian faith to the world of healthcare, including mental health care. People can easily find us online. But I would also say if there's people out there who are interested in exploring that connection more, we do offer some opportunities for clinicians, especially, to study with us in seminary, just like I did years ago, to more deeply understand how does your faith matter for the world of healthcare and mental health care. And if anybody's interested in more conversation, I welcome that. And I also just appreciate people's interest in the book and welcome opportunities for a conversation with people about that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking a little time to be on with us.
Thanks so much.